every country and every people create a sacred landscape. Monuments like the one behind me tie the community I'm in to larger events that happened in the community, but also in places far away. Sacred landscape is part of culture. The native people in each tribe created their own sacred sites that linked the tribe to particular deeds of the past, particular moments, and even to gods and goddesses, heroes and spirits. Streams and rivers, waterfalls, ponds, hills and mountains that stood out particularly, and of course, boulders proved to be sacred sites for native people across North America. Big rocks and cliffs. In the Northeast, we have a lot of big rocks. How many of these big rocks and cliffs were at one time in the 12, 15, 20,000 year human history of the Northeast, when the native peoples' tribes moved back and forth across this landscape, sometimes in harmony with each other, but quite often at war with each other? Do you think that this cliff face that I'm looking at right here, do you think this might have once been a sacred site? Have you ever heard of the Pnyx? But the Pnyx is Athens' speaking stone. This is where people like Pericles and Callisthenes and Themistocles and all the others got up and addressed the Athenian democracy. It forms kind of a rostra, as the Romans would say. All over the ancient world, heights were valued in addressing the multitude. I can promise you that at some point, a native person addressed a throng of native people from that cliff face right there. It's perfect. In fact, where I'm standing with the river 30 yards behind me is a perfect place for native people to have made a camp. That cliff wasn't built. That cliff connected to the very bedrock of the Berkshires. It ain't going nowhere. Nobody moved it. Nobody built it. But it was certainly used by native people. If we dig test pits, I'm guaranteeing you that we're going to find evidence of native campsites right here where I'm standing. Right here, because right behind me is our river valley. One of three that moves from the Connecticut River out into the Berkshire Hills. When you see these old cliffs, just like when you see our glacial erratics, and some are huge and dramatic and really cool, don't think that they have no part in the history of the native people. So here in this mixed hardwood forest in western Massachusetts, we have this beautiful example of a glacial erratic rock. Oh, and the turkeys have been kicking around in here too, see? They're having fun. This is a glacial erratic. What that means is this sucker was picked up by one of those great glacial ice sheets long ago. The Laurentide Glacier was over our heads, purportedly in some places 2 miles of ice, grinding its way south toward Long Island Sound, depositing all that sand that we now see as Long Island, and all the way out to Cape Cod and the islands as it entered the sea in its terminal moraine, and it was picking up rocks like this and giving them a ride, grinding them up like a giant snowplow and just carrying them. And that's what we have here, a glacial erratic rock. Look at the size of the thing, huh? You can see beautiful, young, look at this root right here of this maple tree that's growing right out of the rock. Look at that. Look at how strange that looks, huh? That root growing right down a crack in the rock, slowly opening that crack up, because that's what trees do, that the root makes as it comes out of the ground. This could be a lot older than what I think it is. I mean, it looks like a 35-year-old maple, but it could be much older. But this is a really cool deal, these glacial erratics. And of late, just like with the marker trees, we've got this movement all over the internet. We have people talking about native people moving these rocks. I mean, this is a really cool rock, and native people, I'm sure, would have used them as way markers, and some of them might have actually been a sacred site. There were dozens and dozens of tribal people that lived where I'm standing right now over thousands of years from the time the glaciers retreated, the last ones being the Tunxus. So looking at this, yeah, it might have been a sacred site, but it certainly wasn't moved. They didn't roll this here. They didn't have the wherewithal or the ability to do it. To roll a rock like this, what do you need? Okay, you need a lot of people. What else? You need this thing called the agricultural surplus. People have got to be able to have enough to eat if you're going to expect them to quarry and move rocks and create monumental architecture. So, taking a look at this, really cool. Look at that. Look at the hairy crest of the rock with the ferns growing. How neat is that? I don't even know what this thing weighs. But it is funny. People do say native people rolled these rocks. Not necessarily this one, but ones like it. Maybe there's one that they did. There's that crazy stone they found out in the Taunton River that looks like it's got Carthaginian writing on it, or some kind of petroglyph. The Dighton stone, you can look it up. I'm going to actually go out there and do a video on it because it's pretty cool. But these rocks, archaeologists have done excavations, not on all of them, but on some of them. They've never found any evidence, like flakes, like anything that would suggest that the rock was moved. Look at, we bump into this rock. We go, holy cow, this is cool. And don't think that native people didn't stumble on this 400 years ago, 800 years ago, 1,000 years ago. In fact, they probably used it rather than a waymarker tree, right, an Indian trail tree, rather than one of those. Would it make more sense that they would have arranged their trails from waymarkers like this to other waymarkers like this? Let's be realistic. But the farmer that owned this land after the native people left, he couldn't do anything with this. He basically pastured his merino sheep around it, and after that, he made a hayfield out of it. So now we have regrowing forest, and the glacial erratic remains. I can just stand here and go, that's awesome. Why is it hard for us to imagine that this was a special place for them, even if they didn't move it? Why do they have to move it? But we have no examples of real examples, proven examples, accepted examples of native people working in stone until Stonewall John and the Queen's Castle over in Warwick, Rhode Island. And Stonewall John was doing his thing in the 1660s, and he learned how to build with stone from the Euros, the English. I made a short talking about this rock one time and saying, don't think the native people rolled it here. And I had people telling me that it was aliens from outer space that put it here, that the biblical flood put it here, that the race of giants that predates us put it here, that the giant native people put it here. I got all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of mystery in our forests. Just trying to figure out the history of the forests from the time of the native people to now without making things up. And I certainly love people getting out and getting into history and thinking and questioning and pondering. And I was a little kid out here doing the same thing a long time ago. I thought all of our stone walls were built by soldiers in the American Revolution to try to protect their area from British attack. That's what I thought. No teacher ever told me that's not the case until I got into middle school. And then I had a great guy named Taylor Cook, science teacher, who knew all about natural history and the forest clearances, and he set me straight way back then. Also told me about glacial erratics and all kinds of other good stuff. Prior to that, I was speculating. I was using what I knew and what I learned. And I was taking that information and applying it to the world around me, which is what you're supposed to do. But the more you get into history, the more you realize that there are all kinds of rabbit holes. And while you know a lot about one thing, you realize, holy cow, there's so much more to know. Really amazing what we've allowed to happen to our sacred landscapes. Landscapes that nurtured the early colonists and allowed America to grow into a superpower. These landscapes are now in so many places a ruin because America's moved on and they've left the people who made it possible behind. These villages that supported these factories are now decaying hulks, like so many of the trees attacked by invasive species. We can see a sacred mountain here, Toccoa Mountain, which guards the Westfield River Gorge at Warnoco, where the native people came long ago every spring to fish for salmon and shad, alewives and herring that came in abundance to this awesome place. This was, hard to believe now, a sacred landscape. Standing in front of what is a sacred site to young people today, let's take a look at Warnoco's Great Falls. And the water's low, it's July, late July, but you can see that the Westfield River has been carving its way through this very narrow gorge for thousands and thousands of years, creating what we call glacial potholes. And imagine that plunge pool right there and the number of fish that were caught from that plunge pool by native fishermen over so long, so many years. A little bit below the position I'm at now is the pool on the other side of the sacred wall here. And that pool is a sight. Look at a blue heron flying up the river. He doesn't care. It's still a sacred site to him.